The world is spun between two giant hands of ice. So welcome to our next unit for Hail and Home, boys. And that line is from a radio play, something that we don't hear much of anymore, but certainly way back in the 1940s when this play was written, radio plays were incredibly exciting. People loved them right through the 30s, 40s and 50s. There was no television, of course, so it was the thing to do. The world is spun between two giant hands of ice. And I think if you have a look at the photograph on this page, a wonderful shot of the Earth, you can probably envisage that it's a poetic reference, and it very much is. There are lines of poetry in this radio play which is about exploration to the South Pole, the race to the South Pole in 1911 and 12 with Robert Falcon Scott and Roald Amundsen. And the author of that poem, or the radio play, was Douglas Stewart. And he's referring to the fact that if you held the globe and two giant hands referred to the North Pole and the South Pole, of course, that spins the Earth in it. This radio play, Fire on the Snow, is a dramatic piece of work. I'm only asking you to listen to a couple of minutes of it, and it is a rather confronting conversation that we listen to. And it is between Dr. Wilson and the surviving men. Roald Amundsen and Scott set out to be the first to the South Pole. Amundsen from Norway got there first and left. Scott and his men got there several days later and were devastated to see the Norwegian flag and a note saying, "We got here first." So they had to turn around. So they had walked already over 800 miles, well over 1,000 kilometres dragging a sled, had come second and realised they had to get back home now, where men were waiting on the edge of Antarctica to pick them up and sail them back. They sort of began to realise they weren't going to make it. Incredible weather, incredibly bad weather, locked them in their tents for days as they had to do the return journey of over 1,000 kilometres, dragging sleds. One man died quite quickly and a second man walked to his death like a hero. Oates decided that he couldn't slow the rest of the party down, and he famously said one morning as the wind hurled itself at the tent again and they knew they couldn't march, he said, "I'm just going for a walk, I may be some time." Got up and left the tent. So we're talking over 100 years ago, just over 100 years ago this event happened, and what I'm going to ask you to do is to listen to a rather confronting couple of minutes where Douglas Stewart, the author of this radio play, has recreated the scene from Scott's diaries, which were found in the tent by a rescue party a year or so later, when the men have decided that they are very concerned, there is very little chance they're going to survive. And in those days, the painkiller was opium, and they wanted the doctor to hand out the opium pills. So if things got really bad, they could take those pills and sort of slip away peacefully rather than suffer all the way to the end with absolutely no chance of survival or rescue. And Dr. Wilson powerfully says he will not, and he gives three very good reasons as to why he will not hand out the opium to the men. And that's the part we're going to listen to, and I'm going to get you to prepare a video response that introduces your answer, tells us the three reasons that Dr. Wilson gave the men, and also offers you the chance to weave into that answer some research. I'm going to show you a very memorable example of a video from a Year 7 boy a year or two ago on another topic, but he went the whole hog, and you'll see that towards the end with a brilliant short snippet of Raymond's presentation to us. But the world is spun between two giant hands of ice is the opening line of this radio play. I've got some scenes now that we're going to go through and you're going to have a look at, which sets in your mind very clearly the picture of what these men went through. Understand, travelling to the South Pole over 100 years ago was a little bit like going to Mars today. No one knows where you are. No one knows where you are, and no one can get in contact with you. So, Fire on the Snow, one of the great, great exploration stories and one of the great exploration tragedies of all time. Let's find out a little bit more about it.
Step by step, pulling their heavy load, the five and marched on over the hypnotic landscape. As they neared the South Pole, their weary spirits lifted.
It was Bertie Bowers who spotted what looked like a small black speck on the horizon, and he thought first of all that it was some sort of natural formation. But of course, as they got closer, the horrible truth became inescapable. What they'd actually been looking at was a flag, which had been left as a marker by Amundsen and his Norwegian party.
The date was January 16th, 1911. Scott and his men had traveled over 800 miles in 78 days, only to discover that Amundsen had already captured their prize. For Scott, it was pain almost beyond reason.
We have had a horrible day. Great God, this is an awful place, and terrible enough for us to have labored to it without the reward of priority.
Scott and his men could only guess at the events which had brought the Norwegians to victory.
This is the photograph taken at the South Pole, boys. They don't look particularly happy, and they're not. Scott stands in the middle with the English flag behind him, and his four companions stand and stare at the camera, knowing, of course, that they've come second, and that this incredible journey is, in their minds, a failure, despite the incredible achievement they have made of undertaking this distance. These men dragged sleds, which was a big decision, and many people question that. The Norwegians had dogs, husky dogs, and were in far better physical shape as a result. The Year 7 boys in my class several years ago began to wonder how much those sleds weighed when they're pulling them across the snow. We worked out that it was a bit like having me sitting on a sled for over 800 miles and dragging one each. So they were pretty heavy. So this photograph is the 5 men at the pole. If you're wondering how they took the photograph, because there wasn't a sixth man, if you look carefully at the figure in the bottom left, you can see in his right hand there is a string line. And what that is a switch which took the photographs. And they didn't stay long. I think by the end of that day, they packed up and started the journey home, which we know was a disaster. What you are looking at in this photograph, boys, is the plant, the poppy plant, from which opium is made. Opium these days is grown and actually turns into heroin. So you can understand it is a dreadful scourge. But the plant, its capabilities to relieve pain have been recognised for over 500 years. In the times of Captain Cook, so in the sailing ships, the British Navy, it was turned into something called laudanum, which was a very bitter tasting drink. So it was dissolved into water. That was almost like a bright red colour, and it was a very powerful painkiller. And it's only in the last 100 years that it's you need a prescription for it. There have been wars fought over this, and you know there still are wars fought over it. But opium is the basis of many modern painkiller medicines that are legal and that are really help people in surgery. But certainly, on the black market, that this is a terrible, terrible drug. But it was the painkiller that these men would have taken, and anyone in their situation who was alive in those days was prescribed or could take opium as a very, very powerful painkiller.
There's one thing, though. Wilson, you see how it is. The soldier's done, and God knows who'll be next. You, Bowers, myself. The thing is waiting to strike at each of us. Now we're all played out, and whoever it strikes may be forced to face it alone, as this brave fellow wants to. Give us your opium. Open your kit now, and we'll share the tablets. The time may come when suffering's merely stupid, to prolong it vicious.
You're asking a hard thing against my principles.
We make our own laws here.
There's a certain code a doctor lives to. Suicide doesn't come into it. And that's what the opium means.
Suicide is choosing.
When you have no choice, where is the harm in making a hard thing easy? Suppose I had no opium, or you thought I hadn't. You'd fight to the end. And surely that is better. Having the means of death so easy to use, we might be tempted to defeat and weakness. Spoil all that we've done.
There won't be any weakness. But I, as leader, won't ask any man to suffer needless pain of body or mind.
I wish you'd leave this thing to me. Let me, as the doctor, see that no one suffers more than is right to ask. I make it my business to care for each of you, right to the very end. We may be separated. You may die first. I can't give you the means to destroy life. Give us the stuff or we'll take it.
No need for violence.
Let him give us the tablets. Wilson, you've no right to sit in judgment on men in this hell of ice. I'm not judging. I'm thinking of how I'll be judged.
You've made your protest.
So that's a pretty powerful scene, boys. Dr. Scott, Wilson, Oates and Bowers are in the tent, and they're discussing, well, they're pretty well demanding, aren't they, that Dr. Wilson gives them the opium tablets so they can take them if they wish, not to fight any longer. And obviously what they're talking about is they want to die peacefully. If they take a few of those, that'll do it, rather than fight to the end. Dr. Wilson, if you listen carefully, gives 3 reasons. Pretty powerful reasons, and one of them refers to the doctor's oath. You might need do a bit of research on that, but if you look up doctor's oath, you will find that doctors take a very, very solemn vow, and they read an oath before they graduate. And there's a line in that which would clearly prevent any doctor from providing medicine he knows people will do harm to themselves with. So that's one of the reasons. I'm not asking you in this first week to prepare your video. I just want you to see if you can make a note of what those reasons are, and when we meet again next week, we will then have a big discussion about what those 3 reasons are and begin to put together your responses. The task for this first week for Hale at Home is simply to listen to this part of the play and see if you can make a quick note of the 3 reasons you think were the strongest that you heard then in the responses from Dr. Wilson to Captain Oates.
This year, we remember the 100th anniversary of the greatest maritime disaster in peacetime in the entire history of maritime expeditions. I'm talking about the RMS Titanic.